Reverend Dr. Frost, the writer of today's award-winning sermon, was an esteemed spiritual thinker, writer, and speaker. His gifts enlightened, challenged, and drew many seekers to Unitarian Universalism. He worked tirelessly on behalf of liberal religion and built spiritual communities. His sermons emphasized deeper personal relationships, and his preaching revealed love and concern for all people. He gave 41 years of dedicated service to the UU ministry. In his spare time, he enjoyed gardening, especially roses, wood crafting, furniture building, and hiking. We will next hear one of his sermons, Playing with the Italians, written by Edward Frost, read by Rita Brown, our president.
Thanks, Sheila. I just moved this. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Is this good? Okay. I want to give a shout out to Celeste Stickney, who is on today. We were looking for some help with sermons with Reverend Janet being on leave. Celeste found this sermon and sent us several, actually. So thank you, Celeste, who was and is still a member of our congregation. This is a story about self-discovery, personal power, and taking a stand that would make a difference. And I dedicate this today to the spirit of Tad Crawford, who made a difference. My father was furious when he heard I had been playing with the Italians. That's the first thing I remembered. On the last day of a conference, I attended a workshop. I really wanted to read it from here. Sorry. On the last day of a conference, I attended a workshop that sounded harmless enough. It had to do with what one person could do to create a sustainable environment. To my horror, the leader started right in by asking us to hold hands with the person next to us. I usually try to avoid these kinds of things, the hand holding and the hugging and the massaging of the feet, that sort of thing. But it was too late. The woman beside me was clearly a worship pro and quickly grabbed my hand in a very firm grip. We were instructed to tell each other a story about the first time in our memories which we had taken independent action to make a difference. I'd gone to hear a good talk, maybe be inspired, and maybe find something that'll help me write a sermon. But we were going to share. You go first, I said. Off she went with barely a breath. Part of my brain registered her story, while the other part was frantically trying to come up with something that I was going to say when it was my turn. I had nothing. The bell rang. My partner stopped talking. I was on. I had nothing. For an awful moment, my mind was blank. And then it came out. The story of an experience I had not merely forgotten, but actually didn't know I knew. I was 7 years old, perhaps 8, and being raised in England. It was in the immediate aftermath of the war. We lived in a very large city across from a park. And in the winter, we had some snowfalls, not very often, but when we did, we kids would take off on our sleds to the long hill in the center of the park. That winter, we discovered the hill had been adopted by the Italians, the Italian prisoners of war. The war had long been over. They were held in minimum security while governments figured out how to get them home. confined to the camps during the night. They were free to roam the city during the daylight. They had discovered the park and the iced-over hill. They had no skis, but they had hobnailed boots that served well enough in a sport that was second nature to them. Knees bent, arms outspread, they flew down the hill, laughing and shouting in their wonderful un-English language, thrilling in the familiar bite of the cold wind. They had survived, they were alive, and soon they were going home. We found each other, the children and the Italians. The first brave boy, and it wasn't me, allowed himself to be picked up, slung over, and onto the shoulders of an alpine skier, sand skis, borne laughing and screeching down the hill. The adventure went on for days. We rushed to the hill after school and early in the frosty weekend mornings. Friends were made, friendship and trust. Hey, Harry, look, no hands. One evening, I came into the house flushed and breathless. What on earth have you been doing? Playing with the Italians, I said with joy and pride. My father was furious. They were the enemy. But the war is over. They don't have any guns. They didn't have any guns. They weren't bombing us. And they didn't even want to fight us. That's what they said. But I was up against the official view. We had spent the night to a better part of 2 years in a damp and stinking air raid shelter. Much of the city was still in ruins. Great Aunt Rose had died in the London Blitz, and I was playing with the enemy. Loud and clear, stay away from the Italians. I was a good boy, obedient, happy, my dad's pal, but something was wrong with being forbidden such joy and friendship because of something called the enemy, a concept that didn't fit my experience of these loving and life-loving men. I disobeyed. It had been a long afternoon of sliding and walking and playing soccer. I must have been late leaving for home because as I was leaving the park, my father was crossing the street. What have you been doing? He shouted, getting right to it. Tears fought back. Then my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth. I was not grown enough yet for that British stiff upper lip, but I came out with it. I was playing with the Italians. He slapped my face. That was terrible. It was the most terrible moment of my life. Terrible more the shock of it than the pain. My father never hit me, and he never did again. And here's the moment remembered that started the story. I remember looking full into his anger and saying, all right, but I'm going back. It's odd, I don't remember anything that happened after that. No doubt there were threats about further disobedience and what might happen to me. But my parents must have given it up, because I did, in fact, go back to play with the Italians until one day they were gone. That was not the end of the story, I told my workshop companion. When this part of the workshop exercise was over, the leaders asked if anyone wanted to share with the whole group what they had said to their partners. I couldn't believe myself. What was I doing? My hand was up, and I was going to share. I told the story again and then found myself unfolding what, moment by moment, I was realizing the story meant. It was a story about self-discovery, personal power, and taking a stand that makes a difference. My father's reaction to my playing with the Italians came out of so many hard, sad, and bitter places within him. Some places he had built himself out of the stuff a harsh life had handed him. Some of his reaction simply came out of a culture that made him, a culture of colonial pride that the sun never set on the empire's flag in a world full of foreigners. Foreigners to be fought and hated and feared and ridiculed. There wasn't a nationality that I hadn't been taught to hate, to fear, to watch out for, to look down on, to make fun of. But in that moment of defiance, in that declaration, all right, but I'm going back, in that moment I was confronting all of that with the reality and legitimacy of my own experience. I was separating myself out from the tangled mess of ingrained bigotry, fear, and self-serving stereotypes. Those men were not the enemy. They were just men. Fathers, uncles, brothers, sons, they were friends. They were not evil. And if that laughter and friendship and joy sharing was evil, then I was going to play with it and know it firsthand. My father was wrong. My parents were wrong. And if that's how everybody thought, then everybody could be wrong, and I would forever have to make up my own mind and trust my own inner sense of rightness. That's what the workshop leaders were helping us to find, of course, that moment in our lives in which rightness, truth, and justice were revealed so crystal clear and unadorned that acting upon it was a matter of course. After all, the story I recovered was not about courage. The point is not that I had the nerve to defy my father so I could go back and have fun with my friends. What came to me so clearly as I recounted the story was that I was determined to go back to my friends quite simply because it was the right thing to do. Not only was it the right thing to do, it was necessary. I was going back to play with the Italians because my parents' reason for forbidding me, their reason, and perhaps the entire adult culture's reason, was so clearly and so arguably wrong. I was not defying my father as much as I was responding to something no less than illumination. My experience of the men I played with was the pure experience of relationship with people, not as Italians, not as foreigners, and certainly not as the enemy. The poet Wordsworth wrote that we came to earth trailing clouds of glory. He was expressing popular romantic notion of his time that the newborn are embodiments of pure spirits, that we are born with all the inherent power we need to fulfill our possibilities. That power to fulfill our possibilities is what some have called our true self. From birth, then, our true self begins to be suppressed by the social demand to conform to conventional experience. Originality, unique individuality begins to fall under the requirements of the herd. This is disempowerment, the empowerment of the masses and the disempowerment of the individual. Think of the power of the Nazis' soldiers amassed at the rally in Nuremberg. Think of how disempowered each of those soldiers had to be to make the power of the mass possible. The leaders of the workshop I attended knew that each of us has given up much of our personal power along the way. We've given up much of our individual power to facilitate the routine adjustments to everyday life. My childhood experience, with its illumination of my power to see truths to which my own parents and teachers were blind, that experience did not fade from memory. In time, the story itself was lost, and perhaps with the lost story, was lost something of that awesome, absolute conviction. Like most of us, I had forgotten that I had the power to stand up before the world and declare what I knew and vow to act on it. Somewhere in us is a story in which we are the hero, fearless of the gods and the giants, knowing for a certainty that right makes might. And each of you has a story waiting to be remembered about the power you had and still have to make a difference. Begin to tell your story to someone. Begin just by saying, the first time I realized I could make a difference was, and your story will rush forward to be told. By the way, as it happened, the story of my story had not ended. The people in the workshop were obviously moved. There was a hearty round of applause, and the program was over. As I was making my way out of the crowded room, a young woman came up to me and said, "My grandfather was an Italian prisoner of war in your city. He often spoke of playing with the boys in the park. Thank you for playing with my grandfather."